The sound of shattering glass cut through the afternoon air like a gunshot, and Sarah Mitchell knew in that instant her life was about to change forever. She stood frozen in the middle of Copper Creek's dusty main street, her basket of groceries scattered at her feet, watching as hostile faces emerged from storefronts and saloons. The telegram clutched in Mrs. Henderson's trembling hand told a story Sarah had prayed would never reach this remote Colorado mining town. Her father, accused of embezzlement back in Denver, had apparently implicated several Copper Creek investors before vanishing into the night. Now, 3 days after the news broke, the anger had finally found its target. "Your father's a thief!" someone shouted from the growing crowd. "He took our money, girl, our savings!" Another voice joined in. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as more townspeople poured into the street. She had lived in Copper Creek for only 6 months, arriving last autumn of 1876 to teach at the small schoolhouse after her mother's death. She barely knew her father anymore, had not seen him in 2 years, yet here she stood, bearing the weight of his sins. "Please," she tried to say, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I did not know anything about this." "Liar!" Mrs. Henderson spat, her face twisted with rage. "You Mitchells are all the same, thieves and liars." The crowd pressed closer. Sarah could smell whiskey on their breath, see the dangerous glint in their eyes. Her back hit the wooden post of the general store awning. There was nowhere to run. "String her up," someone called from the back. "Make her pay what her father owes." "Tar and feather the lying witch." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She was 22 years old, and she was going to die in this dusty street for crimes she did not commit. Her fingers gripped the wooden post behind her until splinters dug into her palms. Then the crowd went silent. The change was so sudden, so complete, that Sarah thought perhaps she had fainted. But no, she was still standing, still breathing, and the mob was still there. They had simply stopped moving, stopped shouting, their faces turned toward something behind them. A man walked through the parted crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never feared another human being in his life. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed carved from the mountain granite itself. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, tied back loosely with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered his jaw. He wore buckskin pants and a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. A large hunting knife hung at his belt, and a rifle was slung across his broad back, but it was not his size or his weapons that held the crowd frozen. It was something in his eyes, a fierce intelligence combined with a wildness that spoke of years spent in the high country where men answered to no law but their own. He stopped 10 feet from Sarah and turned to face the mob. Then, with a simple gesture that somehow carried more authority than any lawman's badge, he raised his hand. Nobody dared move. "This is done," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together, but there was no anger in it, just absolute certainty. Jonas, Mr. Peterson the barber, finally found his voice. "This does not concern you. Her father stole from us, from all of us." The mountain man called Jonas did not turn his head. His eyes swept across the crowd with the patience of a predator assessing prey. "Did she steal from you, Peterson?" "Well, no, but her father." "Did she?" Jonas interrupted, his voice dropping lower. "No," Peterson admitted. "Anyone here have proof she knew about her father's business?" Jonas asked the crowd. Silence. "Anyone here see her take a single cent that was not hers?" More silence. Someone shuffled their feet in the dust. "Then we are done here," Jonas said. He lowered his hand slowly and turned to face Sarah. Up close, he was even more imposing. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he was somewhere in his late 20s or early 30s. But those eyes, a startling gray like storm clouds, held a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his rugged appearance. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then come with me, now." She did not hesitate. Whatever danger this stranger might pose, it was nothing compared to what the mob had intended. She stepped away from the post on trembling legs and followed Jonas as he turned and walked back through the crowd. The townspeople parted before him like water around a boulder. They did not speak as they walked through town. Jonas moved with a quiet efficiency, his long strides eating up the distance. Sarah had to hurry to keep pace, her heart still racing, her mind reeling from how quickly everything had changed. They passed the schoolhouse where she taught, the small church where she attended services every Sunday, the boarding house where she rented a room. All places that had felt like the beginning of a new life just hours ago. Now they felt like memories of someone else's existence. Jonas led her to the edge of town where a massive gray horse waited, tied to a post outside the last building. The animal was as imposing as its owner, standing at least 17 hands high, with intelligent eyes and scars that spoke of a hard life in rough country. "Get on," Jonas said, untying the reins. "Where are we going?" Sarah finally found her voice. "My cabin, up in the high country. You cannot stay in town tonight. Maybe not for a while." "But my things, my position at the school—" "Your things will not matter if you are dead," Jonas said bluntly. He turned to face her fully. "That mob was half drunk and full of anger looking for a target. I stopped them today, but I cannot be in town every minute. They will come for you again when they work up the courage. Right now, you need to be somewhere safe until heads cool and sense returns." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that the townspeople were reasonable folks who would never really hurt her, but she had seen their faces, heard the hatred in their voices. Jonas was right. "I do not even know you," she said softly. Something flickered across Jonas's weathered face. "Name's Jonas Blackwood. I trap and hunt in these mountains. I come into town once a month for supplies and to sell furs. I've never hurt a woman in my life, and I do not aim to start now. But I understand if you would rather take your chances here." He said it simply, without pressure, and somehow that made Sarah trust him more than any amount of persuasion would have. She looked back at the town, at the faces still watching from doorways and windows, and made her decision. "Help me up," she said. Jonas's hands, calloused and strong, gripped her waist and lifted her onto the horse as easily as if she weighed nothing. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Sarah stiffened at the intimate contact, but Jonas maintained a respectful distance as much as possible on horseback. "Hold on," he said, and urged the gray horse into a steady trot. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape as they climbed higher into the mountains. The trail was rough, barely more than a game path in places, but Jonas guided the horse with practiced ease. Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body behind her, could smell pine and wood smoke and leather. It should have frightened her, being alone with this strange mountain man, heading into wilderness where no one would hear her if she screamed. Instead, she felt safer than she had in days. After an hour of steady climbing, Jonas finally spoke. "Your father really steal that money, or—" Sarah closed her eyes against the shame. "I do not know. I have not seen him in 2 years. After my mother died, he became distant, focused only on his business ventures. He sent me money for my teaching position here, but never visited, never wrote more than brief notes. I knew he was involved with mining investments, but I never asked questions. Maybe I should have." "Not your fault what he did or did not do," Jonas said. "Every person answers for their own choices. The law might not see it that way. They might come looking for me, thinking I know where he is or where he hid the money." "Let them come," Jonas said, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah believe he meant it. "My cabin is not easy to find. We will figure things out once we get there." They rode higher as the sun sank toward the western peaks. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and the distant promise of snow from the higher elevations. Sarah had never been this far into the mountains. The landscape was beautiful and harsh, with steep valleys and towering rock faces that made her feel incredibly small. Finally, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they emerged into a small clearing. A cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. It was larger than Sarah had expected, well-maintained, with a small barn nearby and a stream running clear and cold along one edge of the clearing. Jonas dismounted and helped Sarah down. Her legs nearly buckled after the long ride, and his hands steadied her until she found her balance. "Not much, but it is home," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "It is beautiful," Sarah said honestly. There was something peaceful about this place, isolated yet not lonely. wild yet somehow tamed by the cabin's solid presence. Jonas led the gray horse to the barn while Sarah waited, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The day's terror had drained her completely. When Jonas returned, he guided her into the cabin and lit several oil lamps. The interior was surprisingly comfortable. A large fireplace dominated one wall, with a sturdy table and chairs nearby. A cooking area occupied another corner, well stocked with supplies. Furs and hides hung on the walls, and a loft area above held what looked like a sleeping area. Everything was clean and orderly, not what Sarah had expected from a bachelor mountain man's home. "You can have the loft," Jonas said, already moving to build a fire. "I will sleep down here. There are extra blankets up there. I will make us some food once this gets going." "You do not have to do all this," Sarah said. "I can help." "You have had a terrible day," Jonas interrupted gently. "Let me take care of things tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Sarah sank into one of the chairs, too tired to argue. She watched as Jonas efficiently built a fire and began preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread. His movements were economical, confident, the actions of a man completely comfortable in his solitude. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 5 years," Jonas said, stirring the pot. "Came out from Missouri after the war. Did not much care for being around people anymore. The mountains do not judge, do not lie, do not start wars over politics and pride." "You were in the war?" "Union side. Saw things no man should see. Did things I am not proud of." He glanced at her, and Sarah saw old pain in those gray eyes. "But that is all behind me now. The mountains helped me find peace again." They ate in companionable silence. The food was simple but good, and Sarah realized she had not eaten since breakfast. After the meal, Jonas heated water so she could wash, then politely excused himself to tend to his horse and check his traps while she changed into one of his clean shirts to sleep in. It hung on her like a dress, smelling of pine and soap. She climbed to the loft and found it surprisingly cozy, with a thick mattress stuffed with what felt like feathers, plenty of warm blankets, and even a small window that looked out over the moonlit clearing. She could hear Jonas moving around below, the quiet sounds somehow comforting rather than threatening. Sarah lay in the darkness, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. Just this morning she had been a school teacher with a simple, quiet life. Now she was a fugitive in the mountains, dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had risked the town's anger to save her. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt an odd sense of rightness, as if this was exactly where she was meant to be. Below, Jonas banked the fire and settled onto what sounded like a bedroll on the floor. Within minutes, his breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. Sarah closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under, the last thought drifting through her mind being that Jonas Blackwood's eyes were the exact color of the mountain storms. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the small window, and for a moment, Sarah could not remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. "Easy," Jonas called from below. "You are safe. I made breakfast." Sarah climbed down the ladder, still wearing his oversized shirt. Jonas was at the cooking area, his back to her, and morning light revealed details she had missed in yesterday's chaos. His hair was damp, suggesting he had bathed in the cold stream, and he wore a clean shirt that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. The muscles in his arms flexed as he worked, and Sarah found herself staring before quickly looking away. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, yesterday and this morning." Jonas turned and handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You would have done the same." "I am not sure I would have been brave enough to face down an angry mob," Sarah admitted. "Bravery is not about not being afraid," Jonas said. "It is about doing what is right even when you are afraid. You stood there yesterday facing them. That took courage." They ate breakfast, and in the morning light, Sarah studied her rescuer more carefully. He was handsome in a rough, untamed way, with strong features and weathered skin that suggested he was perhaps 30 years old. His hands were scarred from hard work, and there was a quiet strength about him that had nothing to do with his impressive size. "Wake, what do we do now?" Sarah asked finally. "I cannot hide here forever." "No," Jonas agreed, "but you cannot go back to town yet either. Give it a few days, let tempers cool. Meanwhile, I will ride down and see what the situation is. Maybe talk to the marshal, see if there is any actual legal trouble or if it was just angry folks looking to blame someone. You would do that for me? I would, Jonas said simply. But that means you would be here alone for the day. Can you handle that? Sarah looked around the cabin, at the solid walls and the peaceful clearing visible through the windows. I think so. What should I do while you are gone? Whatever you like. There are some books on the shelf if you read. Food in the stores. The stream is safe to drink from. Just stay close to the cabin and keep the door barred while I am gone. After breakfast, Jonas prepared to leave. He showed Sarah how to work the door bar, where he kept a rifle just in case, though he assured her no one could track them up here. Then he saddled the gray horse and rode out, leaving Sarah alone in the mountain clearing. The silence was profound. Sarah had never experienced quiet like this, without the sounds of town life, without other people. At first it was unsettling, but gradually she began to appreciate it. She could hear the stream, the wind in the pines, the occasional call of a bird. Nothing else. She spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly. Jonas's book collection surprised her with its range from practical guides about surviving in wilderness to poetry by Whitman and novels by Cooper. There were detailed journals filled with observations about wildlife and weather patterns, written in a surprisingly elegant hand. Everything spoke of a man who had deliberately chosen solitude, but had not let it make him less human. In the afternoon, Sarah washed her dress in the cold stream and hung it to dry on a line strung between two trees. She found herself humming while she worked, something she had not done in months. There was something freeing about being here, away from the expectations and judgments of town life. Jonas returned just before sunset, riding in with fresh supplies and a serious expression. Sarah met him outside, her heart sinking at his look. "The marshal wants to talk to you," Jonas said without preamble as he dismounted. "But it is not as bad as it could be. He knows you had nothing to do with your father's dealings. The problem is, some investors from Denver are coming to town tomorrow. They want to question you, see if you know where your father might have gone." "I do not know anything," Sarah said desperately. "I believe you. But they will not take my word for it. You will have to talk to them." Jonas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "I told the marshal you would come down in 3 days. That gives us time to prepare what you will say, and it lets the town cool down a bit more." 3 days, Sarah repeated. 3 more days in this mountain sanctuary before she had to face the world again. "If you are willing to stay," Jonas said, and there was something in his voice that made Sarah look at him carefully. "Are you willing to have me stay?" she asked. Their eyes met and something passed between them, some recognition that neither of them was quite ready to name. "Yes," Jonas said quietly. "I am willing." Those 3 days changed everything. The first morning, Jonas taught Sarah how to fish in the stream. He stood behind her, his large hands guiding hers as she learned to cast the line, and she was acutely aware of his presence, his warmth, the careful way he kept his touch professional, even as something electric seemed to spark between them. "You have done this before," he said with surprise when she caught her first trout within 20 minutes. "My mother used to take me fishing when I was little before she got sick," Sarah said, watching the silvery fish dance on the line. "I had forgotten how much I enjoyed it." "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. She grew up on a farm in Ohio, knew how to do everything. She tried to teach me, but my father wanted me to be a proper lady. After she died, I think I tried to be what he wanted, thinking it might bring him back to me somehow. It never did." Jonas cleaned the fish with quick, practiced movements. "My mother was a teacher, like you. She died when I was young. Fever took her. But I remember how she loved books, loved learning. She would have liked you, I think." It was the most personal thing he had shared, and Sarah felt honored by the confidence. They cooked the trout for lunch, and it was the best thing Sarah had tasted in years. Maybe it was the fresh mountain air, or maybe it was the company, but everything seemed more vivid here, more real. That afternoon, Jonas showed her around his property. He had a substantial operation for one man, with trap lines running through the surrounding forest, a well-tended garden that was just beginning to sprout in the late spring warmth, and the barn that housed not only his gray gelding, named Stone, but also a milk cow and some chickens. You're not just a trapper, Sarah observed. This is a real homestead. It is, Jonas admitted. I filed a claim on this land 2 years ago, proved it up last year. It is mine now, all legal. I thought maybe someday I might want to do more than just survive up here, maybe actually build something. It must get lonely, Sarah said, immediately regretting the presumption. But Jonas did not seem offended. It does sometimes, especially in winter. But loneliness is better than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. I felt that way after the war, nothing but people everywhere, and I could not connect with any of them. Up here, at least, the loneliness is honest. That evening, they sat by the fire after supper, and Jonas asked Sarah about her teaching. She found herself telling him about her students, about the joy of watching understanding dawn in a child's eyes, about her hopes to start a lending library in Copper Creek. Those hopes might be gone now, she said sadly. Maybe, Jonas said, or maybe this is a chance to start fresh somewhere else. You are a good teacher, Sarah. Any town would be lucky to have you. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she liked the way it sounded in his deep voice. What about you? She asked. Do you ever think about leaving the mountains? Sometimes, Jonas admitted. But I would not go back to a big city, maybe a small town, somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could have this, he gestured to the cabin, but also be part of a community again. I am not sure that exists. It might, Sarah said softly. Maybe you just have not found it yet. Their eyes met across the fire, and Sarah felt her breath catch. In the flickering light, Jonas looked almost mythic, like some ancient god of the wilderness. But there was nothing distant or godlike in the way he looked at her, with a warmth and longing that made her heart race. He looked away first, clearing his throat. We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow. But Sarah lay awake in the loft for a long time, listening to Jonas move around below, knowing he was not sleeping either. The second day, a spring storm rolled in, trapping them inside the cabin. Rain hammered on the roof and lightning split the sky, turning the clearing into a gray, misty world. Jonas built up the fire against the damp chill, and they spent the morning in comfortable domesticity. Sarah mended a tear in his shirt, while Jonas worked on repairing a broken trap, their chairs drawn close to the fire. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared opinions on books and different views on politics that led to spirited but good-natured debates. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in years, and Jonas smiled more in that one morning than he probably had in months. You are good at that, Jonas observed, watching her neat stitches. My mother taught me. She said a woman should know how to make things last, how to care for what she has. That's a good philosophy for anyone, Jonas said. He set aside the repaired trap and leaned back in his chair. Can I ask you something personal? You saved my life and took me into your home. I think that earns you the right. Why did you never marry? A woman like you, educated, kind, pretty. You must have had offers. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the casual compliment. There was someone back in Ohio before my mother got sick, a banker's son. We were practically engaged, but when mother became ill and father's business started having troubles, he quietly disappeared. It taught me that people often want you for what you can give them, not for who you are. He was a fool, Jonas said with surprising intensity. Maybe, or maybe he just saw reality more clearly than I did. I was 17 and naive, thinking love could overcome anything. Now I know better. Do you? Jonas asked. Or have you just become cynical? Sarah set down her mending. What about you? You must have left someone behind when you came to the mountains. A shadow crossed Jonas's face. There was a girl before the war. Martha. We were going to marry when I got back, but the war changed me. The things I saw, the things I did, I could not talk about them, could not make her understand. She tried. God bless her, she really tried. But I could see the fear in her eyes when I would wake up shouting from nightmares, could feel her pulling away. I left before she had to choose between duty and happiness. I heard she married a shopkeeper the next year. I hope she is happy. That must have hurt terribly. It did, Jonas admitted, but it was the right choice. She deserved someone whole, someone who could be present with her. I was still trapped in the war, even though it was over. The mountains gave me time to heal, to find myself again. And have you? Found yourself? Jonas looked at her for a long moment. I thought I had, until 3 days ago. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah could not look away from his gray eyes, could not pretend she did not understand what he was saying. Jonas, she whispered. He stood abruptly. I should check on Stone, make sure the barn is staying dry. He went out into the rain, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and the undeniable truth that she was falling for this gentle giant of a man. When Jonas returned an hour later, soaked and shivering, Sarah had hot coffee waiting and a blanket ready. She made him change into dry clothes while she heated soup for lunch. They did not speak about what he had said, but it hummed beneath every interaction, every accidental touch, every shared glance. That afternoon, the rain softened to a gentle patter. Jonas pulled out a battered harmonica and played while Sarah read aloud from a book of poetry. His playing was surprisingly good, adding melody to her words, and Sarah felt as if they were creating something together, some small magic in the dim cabin. As evening approached and the rain finally stopped, they stood together in the doorway, watching clouds break apart to reveal a stunning sunset, painting the wet world in gold and pink. I wish I could stay here forever, Sarah said without thinking. Do you mean that? Jonas asked, his voice rough. Sarah turned to look at him, this strong, wounded man who had shown her more kindness than anyone in her life. I think I do. Jonas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and Sarah leaned into the touch. Sarah. He started, but stopped, shaking his head. This is not right. You are here because you had no choice, because you needed protection. I should not be feeling what I am feeling. What if I am feeling it too? Sarah asked, her heart pounding. You do not know what you are saying. You have been through trauma. You are confused. I am not confused, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. Jonas, I have never felt more clear-headed in my life. These past 2 days with you, I have felt more myself than I have in years. You see me, really see me, not just as someone's daughter or a respectable schoolteacher. You see Sarah. Jonas looked torn between hope and honor. If I kiss you right now, I will not be able to let you go. You understand that? Then do not let me go, Sarah whispered. He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, as if she might break. But Sarah rose on her toes and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up emotion and longing she had been carrying. Jonas made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, his strong arms wrapping around her, and Sarah felt safe and desired and completely alive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. This complicates things. Life is complicated, Sarah said, unable to stop smiling. You were supposed to go back to town tomorrow to talk to the investors. If anyone finds out about this, about us, it will ruin your reputation. My reputation is already ruined by my father's actions. At least this ruin would be one I chose. Jonas laughed, a real laugh that transformed his serious face. You are remarkable, Sarah Mitchell. So are you, Jonas Blackwood. They stood in the doorway, as darkness fell, holding each other, neither wanting to be the first to let go. Finally, Jonas sighed. We should go inside, and you should sleep in the loft, and I should sleep down here, and we should be sensible about this. Should we? Sarah asked mischievously. Yes, Jonas said firmly, though his eyes sparkled with humor. Because I am trying very hard to be an honorable man, and you are making it extremely difficult. They went inside, and true to his word, Jonas was a perfect gentleman. But when Sarah climbed to the loft and looked down, he was watching her with such longing that she almost climbed back down. Instead, she forced herself to settle into the blankets, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges enough without adding scandal to the mix. But she fell asleep smiling, touching her lips where his had been, feeling more hopeful about the future than she had in months. The third day dawned clear and bright, but tension filled the cabin. Today, they would ride back to Copper Creek, and Sarah would have to face the investors and the town's judgment. She dressed in her now clean dress, braided her hair in a simple style, and tried to appear calm even though her stomach churned with anxiety. Jonas was quieter than usual as they ate breakfast and prepared for the ride. Finally, as he was saddling Stone, Sarah touched his arm. Whatever happens today, I want you to know how grateful I am. You gave me shelter when I needed it, and you gave me something even more precious. You reminded me who I am underneath all the fear and obligation." Jonas turned to her, his expression fierce. "Whatever happens today, you are not alone. I will be with you, and if those investors or anyone else tries to hurt you, they will have to go through me first." "My protector," Sarah said softly. "Always," Jonas replied, and kissed her gently. "Now let's get this over with so I can bring you back home." Home. The word sent warmth through Sarah's entire body. She had not had a real home since her mother died. Could this cabin, this mountain clearing, this strong man really become her home? They rode down the mountain in silence, Sarah acutely aware of Jonas's solid presence behind her, his arms around her as he held the reins. As they descended, her anxiety grew. What if the investors had her arrested? What if the townspeople mobbed her again? What if Jonas was hurt trying to defend her? As if sensing her thoughts, Jonas spoke quietly near her ear. "Breathe, Sarah, one moment at a time. That is how you survive difficult things, just one moment at a time." She nodded and tried to follow his advice, focusing on the steady rhythm of Stone's hooves, the warmth of the sun, the strength of Jonas's presence. Copper Creek came into view as the sun reached its zenith. Sarah's mouth went dry. The main street looked peaceful enough, with people going about their business, but she could see how heads turned as they rode in, how conversations stopped. Jonas guided Stone directly to the marshal's office and dismounted before helping Sarah down. His hand at her waist was steady, reassuring. Marshal Grady came out, a weathered man in his 50s who had always been fair with Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, Jonas, thank you for coming." "Where are the investors?" Jonas asked, his tone neutral but his stance protective, keeping himself slightly between Sarah and the marshal. "Inside. They arrived this morning. I will warn you, they are not happy, but I made clear that Miss Mitchell is a respected member of this community and will be treated with courtesy." "Respected?" Sarah could not help the bitter laugh. "Marshal, 3 days ago a mob wanted to tar and feather me." Marshal Grady had the grace to look ashamed. "Folks were angry and drunk, Miss Mitchell. Most regret their actions. If it helps, the school board met yesterday and voted to keep your position open, pending resolution of this situation." That was something, at least. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Let's get this over with." The marshal's office was small, and with 2 well-dressed men from Denver inside, it felt cramped. Jonas had to duck his head to enter, and his size seemed to fill the remaining space. Both investors looked up, and their expressions shifted from annoyance to wariness at the sight of him. "Miss Mitchell," the older investor said, standing. "I am Mr. Harrington, and this is my associate, Mr. Drake. We represent several of your father's investors who lost substantial sums in his scheme." "I understand," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "but I must tell you from the beginning, I know nothing about my father's business dealings. I have not seen him in 2 years. "Convenient," Mr. Drake said with a sneer. "Your father disappears with thousands of dollars, and his daughter claims complete ignorance." "She is not claiming it," Jonas said, his deep voice cutting through the room like thunder. "She is telling you the truth." "And who are you?" Drake demanded. "Someone who does not like seeing innocent people bullied," Jonas replied. His tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. "Sarah had nothing to do with her father's crimes. Question her if you must, but keep a civil tongue or answer to me." Harrington cleared his throat nervously. "Of course. Miss Mitchell, can you tell us when you last had contact with your father?" Sarah took a deep breath and answered truthfully. She explained how her father had sent money for her to take the teaching position in Copper Creek, but it had been bank drafts with no personal correspondence. How he had not visited, had not written about his business, had become essentially a stranger after her mother's death. The men questioned her for over an hour, asking about her finances, her possessions, whether her father had sent anything unusual or mentioned any places he might go. Sarah answered everything honestly, her voice growing hoarse. Throughout it all, Jonas stood behind her chair, a silent but powerful presence. Finally, Harrington sat back. "I believe you, Miss Mitchell. You clearly know nothing. However, I must ask, if your father contacts you in the future, you notify the authorities immediately." "Of course," Sarah agreed. "There is one more matter," Drake said, his eyes calculating. "You are your father's only known heir. If he is never found, his debts become your responsibility. The investors could legally pursue repayment from you." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. But I have nothing. A teacher's salary, a few personal possessions. Exactly, Drake said with satisfaction, which is why we are prepared to offer an alternative. Marry one of the investors willing to absorb your father's debts in exchange for your hand, and the matter is settled. What? Sarah gasped. It is a reasonable solution, Harrington said, though he looked uncomfortable. Mr. Drake himself is a widower and willing to take you as his wife. The debt would be satisfied, you would be cared for, and the matter ends. Sarah looked at Drake with horror. He was at least 50, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. The thought of being his wife made her physically ill. No, she said, absolutely not. You may not have a choice, Drake said, unless you can pay back the money your father stole. She said no, Jonas said, and this time there was no mistaking the danger in his voice. And that is the end of this discussion. This is not your business, Mountain Man, Drake sneered. It is my business, Jonas said, moving to stand beside Sarah, because Sarah Mitchell is going to be my wife. The room went silent. Sarah stared up at Jonas in shock. His jaw was set, his eyes blazing with determination. What? Marshal Grady finally said. You heard me, Jonas said. Sarah and I are engaged to be married. Any debts she might inherit would become mine, and I am more than capable of working them off honestly. But she will not be forced into marriage with anyone, least of all this vulture. Drake stood angrily. You cannot just— I can, Jonas interrupted. Unless there's a law against it, Marshal. Grady looked stunned. No, no law. If you are engaged and you are willing to assume responsibility for her father's debts. I am, Jonas said firmly. Harrington held up his hands. Gentlemen, let's not be hasty. Miss Mitchell, are you agreeing to this arrangement? Sarah looked up at Jonas. His expression was fierce, protective, but in his eyes she saw a question. This was her choice. He had thrown her a lifeline, but she did not have to take it, except she wanted to. Despite the chaos, despite the impossibly short time they had known each other, she wanted this with a certainty that shook her. Yes, she said clearly. Jonas and I are engaged. Drake sputtered with rage, but Harrington looked thoughtful. Very well, I will need documentation of the engagement and a repayment plan for the debts. Draw up the papers, Jonas said. I will sign whatever is needed. The investors left. Drake still furious but unable to argue with the legal solution. Marshal Grady looked between Jonas and Sarah with a mixture of confusion and respect. Are you two really engaged, or was that just to get Drake off her back? He asked. Jonas looked down at Sarah. That is up to Sarah. Sarah's heart was pounding. They had kissed, had admitted feelings, but this was enormous. Marriage, a lifetime commitment to a man she had known for 3 days, and yet she had never been more certain of anything. It is real, she said, if Jonas will have me. If I will have you? Jonas repeated incredulously. Then he laughed and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet. Sarah Mitchell, I would be honored to be your husband. Marshal Grady shook his head in amazement. Well, I will be damned. Jonas Blackwood getting married. Never thought I would see the day. Neither did I, Jonas admitted, setting Sarah down but keeping his arm around her waist. But some things are worth coming down from the mountains for. They left the marshal's office in a daze. The news was already spreading through town. Sarah could see people whispering, pointing. But this time, the attention did not feel hostile. It felt curious, even approving. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who had led the mob 3 days ago, actually approached them on the street. Miss Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I was drunk on anger and grief over my savings, and I took it out on you. That was wrong. I hope you can forgive me. Sarah was so surprised it took her a moment to respond. I understand. You were hurt and scared. We all do things we regret in those moments. Other townspeople approached with similar apologies. Not everyone, some still glared or turned away, but enough that Sarah felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Finally, Jonas guided her away from the main street to a quiet spot near the edge of town. Sarah, we should talk about what just happened. You mean you proposing in front of witnesses? Sarah asked, unable to suppress a smile. Jonas ran a hand through his hair. I should have asked you properly, privately, not blurted it out as a defensive strategy. You deserve better than that. Do I? Sarah asked. She took his hand. marveling at how her small fingers looked wrapped in his large calloused ones. "Jonas, you saved me again today. But more than that, you gave me a choice. You stood beside me and gave me the option to choose my own future. That is more romantic than any formal proposal could be." "I meant it," Jonas said seriously. "Every word. I want to marry you, Sarah. I know it is fast. I know people will say we are crazy, but I have never been more certain of anything. These 3 days with you, I have been happier than I have been in a decade. You make me want to be part of the world again." "I want to marry you too," Sarah said. "And yes, it is fast and people will talk. But I do not care. For the first time in my life, I am choosing something for myself, not what my father wanted, not what is expected, not what is safe. I am choosing you, Jonas Blackwood, with my whole heart." Jonas cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, right there in the open where anyone could see. Sarah kissed him back, not caring who was watching, not caring about propriety or reputation. This was real. This was right. When they broke apart, Jonas was grinning. "We should go back to the cabin and plan this properly. Unless you want a big town wedding?" "God, no," Sarah laughed. "Just us, maybe the marshal to make it legal, and the mountains as witnesses. That's all I need." They rode back up the mountain as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. Sarah leaned back against Jonas's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong, and thought about how much her life had changed in just 3 days. She had lost her position, her reputation, her security, and she had gained everything that really mattered. Back at the cabin, they spent the evening planning their future. Jonas would need to work extra trap lines this year to start paying back the debts, but he was confident he could manage it. Sarah could continue teaching if the school board stood by their decision, riding down from the mountain when weather permitted, or staying in town during the week and coming home on weekends. "Home," Jonas repeated thoughtfully. "I like the sound of that. This cabin being someone's home, not just a hideout." "It already feels like home to me," Sarah admitted, "more than anywhere I have lived since my mother died." "We will build it up," Jonas said, pulling her close on the bench by the fire. "Add on a room or two, maybe eventually a separate schoolhouse if you want to teach up here. There are a few other families scattered through these mountains. Their children could use an education." "You have thought about this," Sarah observed with delight. "I have thought about a lot of things these past 3 days," Jonas admitted. "All of them involve you." They sat together until the fire burned low, talking and dreaming and stealing kisses. When they finally went to their separate sleeping areas, it was with the understanding that this separation was temporary. Soon, very soon, they would be married, and Sarah would share Jonas's bed as his wife. The next week passed in a blur of preparations. Jonas rode to town to file the necessary papers with the investors, showing them his trap lines, his homestead, and his plans for repayment. Harrington seemed satisfied, though Drake remained bitter about losing his chance at a young wife. The school board officially reinstated Sarah's position, and several townspeople came to the cabin to apologize in person for their behavior during the mob. Sarah accepted their apologies with grace, though Jonas remained wary and protective. They were married on a perfect June morning in 1876 in the clearing beside the cabin with only Marshal Grady, the minister, and a few of Jonas's mountain neighbors in attendance. Sarah wore a simple dress she had sewn herself from fabric Jonas had bought in town, and Jonas wore his best clothes, his long hair neatly tied back, his beard trimmed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jonas kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. This was real. This impossible, beautiful thing was really happening. The small group celebrated with a meal Sarah and Jonas had prepared together. Then their guests departed before sunset, leaving the newlyweds alone. "Are you nervous?" Jonas asked as they stood in the cabin doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky. "No," Sarah answered honestly. "I'm exactly where I want to be." Jonas swept her into his arms and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing. He set her down gently and lit the lamps, their warm glow filling the cabin. That night, Jonas loved her with the same careful attention he gave to everything he did. He was gentle and patient, introducing her to the mysteries of marriage with a tenderness that made her feel cherished and safe. Sarah gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body as she had already trusted him with her heart. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed Jonas had moved down from the loft, listening to the night sounds of the mountain and marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "I love you, Sarah Blackwood," Jonas whispered into her hair. "I love you too," Sarah replied, feeling the truth of it in every cell of her body. The following months brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Sarah returned to teaching, riding down the mountain path 3 times a week while Jonas worked his trap lines and tended the homestead. It was exhausting, but rewarding. Her students were delighted to have her back, and Sarah found she loved teaching even more now that she was secure in her personal happiness. Jonas made good progress on repaying the debts, selling premium furs and working as a guide for hunters and miners who needed someone who knew the mountains. The investors received regular payments, and even Drake had to admit that Jonas was honoring his commitment. Winter came early that year, and Sarah moved into the cabin full-time when the passes became too dangerous for regular travel. She missed her students, but loved having uninterrupted time with Jonas. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing music, talking about everything and nothing. Jonas taught her to shoot, to track game, to read weather signs and survive in the wilderness. Sarah taught him about literature, about history, about the wider world beyond the mountains. They were both teaching and learning, becoming more than they had been separately. By spring, Sarah knew she was pregnant. She told Jonas on a warm May evening as they sat watching the sunset from their cabin porch. He had built the porch over the winter, and it was Sarah's favorite spot. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Jonas went very still. Then he turned to her with wonder written across his face. "A baby? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation. But yes, I think we will be parents by late autumn." Jonas let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, careful not to squeeze too tight. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Jonas said. "Sarah, you have given me everything, a home, a purpose, love. Now a child? I do not deserve this much blessing." "Yes, you do," Sarah said firmly. "You are a good man, Jonas Blackwood, the best man I have ever known. Our child is lucky to have you as a father." Jonas placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "I will protect you both. I swear it." Sarah covered his hand with hers. "I know you will." The pregnancy was easier than Sarah had feared. She continued teaching until the summer break, then focused on preparing the cabin for the new arrival. Jonas built a cradle with painstaking care, carving designs of mountains and trees into the wood. The mountain families they knew brought gifts and advice, and Sarah was touched by how the isolated community rallied around them. Jonas was constantly worried, fussing over Sarah and insisting she rest, even when she felt perfectly fine. It was endearing and sometimes frustrating, but Sarah understood his fear. He had lost so much in his life. He was terrified of losing her, the baby. "I'm not made of glass," she told him one evening when he tried to carry her over a perfectly manageable stream. "I know," Jonas said, "but you are carrying everything precious to me. Let me be overprotective. It is the only way I know to cope with being this terrified and this happy at the same time." Sarah softened. "I love you." "I love you too. Both of you," Jonas said, his hand on her growing belly. Their son was born in October 1877, during the first snowfall of the season. The birth was long and difficult, with only a midwife from a neighboring homestead to help. Jonas waited outside, pacing and praying, until finally he heard the thin wail of a newborn. The midwife came out, smiling. "You have a son. Both mother and baby are healthy." Jonas burst into the cabin to find Sarah exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Jonas approached slowly, as if in a dream. He looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby and felt his heart expand in a way he had not thought possible. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He is," Sarah agreed. "I was thinking we could name him after your father." "Henry," Jonas said. "Henry Blackwood. That's a strong name for a mountain boy." He took the baby carefully, and Henry immediately quieted in his large hands. Jonas looked at Sarah with tears in his eyes. "I did not think I could love anything more than I love you. I was wrong." "You do not love him more than me," Sarah teased. "You just love differently. There is enough love for all of us." Those first months with baby Henry were exhausting and wonderful. Jonas was a devoted father, waking for nighttime feedings and insisting on doing his share, despite Sarah's protests that she could manage. He fashioned a sling that let him carry Henry while he worked around the homestead, and the baby seemed perfectly content against his father's broad chest. Sarah watched them together and felt her heart overflow. This was her family. This odd little unit in the mountains, so different from the life she had imagined for herself, and so much better. By the time Henry was a year old, Jonas had completely repaid the investors. The last payment was delivered to Mr. Harrington personally, and the man shook Jonas's hand with respect. "You are a man of honor, Blackwood. I misjudged you at first. I am glad to have been wrong." "I am glad you gave me the chance to prove you wrong," Jonas replied. With the debts cleared, Jonas and Sarah could finally focus entirely on building their life. Jonas expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. He built a larger barn and acquired more livestock. The homestead was thriving. Sarah started a small school in the cabin, teaching children from the scattered mountain families. It was deeply satisfying work, and Jonas built desks and slates for the students. The mountain community was growing, and Sarah felt proud to be part of shaping its future. In the spring of 1879, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. Henry was walking and talking, a bright, curious boy who adored his father and followed him everywhere. Jonas was delighted at the prospect of another child. "Maybe a girl this time," he said hopefully, "a little daughter with your eyes and your smile." "Or another boy to keep Henry company," Sarah countered. "Either way, we are blessed," Jonas agreed. Their second child, a daughter they named Ellen after Jonas's mother, was born in November 1879. She had Sarah's coloring but Jonas's gray eyes, and she was a calm, peaceful baby who seemed content to observe the world around her. Henry adored his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything. Jonas was besotted with his daughter, and Sarah often found him just sitting and staring at Ellen with wonder, as if he could not quite believe she was real. "Oh, you are going to spoil her terribly," Sarah warned. "Probably," Jonas agreed without shame. "But she will also know how to shoot, track, and survive in the wilderness. I will make sure both our children can take care of themselves." True to his word, as Henry and Ellen grew, Jonas taught them the skills of mountain living. Henry took to it naturally, but Ellen surprised everyone by being the better shot and tracker. She was fearless and determined, and Jonas beamed with pride at his fierce little daughter. Sarah continued teaching, and Jonas continued working the land. They built a good life, filled with love and laughter and the simple satisfactions of honest work. The mountain community grew around them, and Jonas became known as someone to turn to for help or advice. The solitary mountain man had become a pillar of the scattered community. In 1882, when a group of investors tried to buy up mountain land for a mining operation that would have destroyed the watershed, it was Jonas who organized the homesteaders to resist. He traveled to Denver and testified before a judge, using his intelligence and his imposing presence to make the case for protecting the land. They won, and the mountains stayed wild. Sarah watched her husband standing up for his community and felt such pride. This was the man who had faced down a mob for a stranger. That protective instinct had never faded. It had just expanded to encompass more people. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons, springs filled with planting and baby animals. Summers with Sarah teaching and Jonas guiding hunters. Autumns with harvest and preparing for winter. Winters with the family cozy in the cabin, telling stories and reading by firelight. Henry grew into a tall, strong young man who looked remarkably like his father. Ellen became a spirited, intelligent girl who excelled at everything she tried. Both children were educated, capable, and kind, a reflection of their parents' values. In 1890, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again at 36 years old. It was unexpected, as Henry was 13 and Ellen was 11, but the whole family was thrilled. Jonas was particularly delighted, loving fatherhood as much in his 40s as he had in his 30s. Their third child, another son they named Thomas, was born in January 1891 during a fierce winter storm. The birth was difficult, and Sarah was older now, but she came through it well. Thomas was a tiny but vigorous baby, and his older siblings doted on him. "Our surprise blessing," Jonas called him, cradling the infant with the same tender care he had shown Henry and Ellen. As the years continued to pass, Sarah sometimes thought about that day in Copper Creek when the mob had surrounded her. If Jonas had not been there, if he had not raised his hand and stopped them, her life would have ended or taken a drastically different turn. Instead, she had found love, purpose, and a family beyond her wildest dreams. In the summer of 1895, Henry, now 18, announced he was interested in studying engineering at a college in Denver. Sarah's heart swelled with pride, even as it ached at the thought of him leaving. Jonas, who had once fled civilization, surprised everyone by encouraging his son. "The world is changing," he told Henry. "The mountains will always be here, but you should see what else is out there, learn what you can, then decide where you want to be." "What if I want to come back here?" Henry asked. "Then you come back," Jonas said simply. "But you will come back because you chose it, not because you never knew anything else. That is important." Ellen, at 16, had no interest in leaving. She was already talking about claiming her own piece of mountain land when she was old enough, about building a homestead like her parents. Jonas taught her everything he knew, and Sarah taught her to read land deeds and legal documents so no one could cheat her. Thomas, at 4, was a whirlwind of energy who kept everyone on their toes. He had Sarah's quick mind and Jonas's fearlessness, a combination that led to frequent adventures and occasional mishaps. One evening in late summer, the whole family sat on the porch Jonas had expanded over the years. Henry was reading a letter about the college program. Ellen was sketching the mountains in a journal. Thomas was playing with a wooden horse Jonas had carved. Sarah was mending, and Jonas was just sitting, watching them all with an expression of deep contentment. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked softly. "That I'm the luckiest man who ever lived," Jonas said. "I spent years thinking I was only good for solitude, that I had nothing left to give to anyone. Then you came into my life, and everything changed." "We saved each other," Sarah said. "I was drowning in other people's expectations and shame. You gave me a place where I could just be myself." "You gave me a reason to be part of the world again," Jonas said. He took her hand, his thumb tracing over the simple gold band he had placed there nearly 20 years ago. "I love you, Sarah Blackwood, more than the day I married you, more than I have words to express." "I love you too," Sarah said, "always." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Sarah looked at her family and felt complete. Her life had not turned out anything like she had planned. It was better. The years continued their steady march. Henry went to college and thrived, though he came home every summer to help with the homestead. He eventually became an engineer, helping design water systems for mountain communities, work that let him stay in the high country he loved while using his education. Ellen did claim her own land at 18, building a cabin with Jonas's help just a few miles from her parents' homestead. She married at 21 to a steady young man from one of the other mountain families, and they built a good life together. She and Sarah remained close, and Jonas beamed with pride at his independent, capable daughter. Thomas grew into a curious, artistic boy who loved drawing and painting the mountains. Jonas encouraged this, even though it was far from his own skills, because he understood that each child had to find their own path. In 1905, Jonas turned 55 and Sarah turned 51. They had been married nearly 30 years, and their love had only deepened with time. Jonas's hair was iron gray now, his beard streaked with white, but he was still strong and vital. Sarah had lines around her eyes and silver in her hair, but Jonas said she was more beautiful than ever. They had 7 grandchildren between Henry's 3 children and Ellen's 4, and the cabin was often filled with chaos and laughter when the family gathered. Jonas, who had once lived in complete solitude, now thrived on the noise and activity. He carved toys for the grandchildren and told them stories of the old days, and they adored their strong, gentle grandfather. One evening, Jonas and Sarah walked to their favorite spot on the ridge overlooking the valley. They had walked this path thousands of times over the years, and it never grew old. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked. "Giving up teaching in town, living up here away from society?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "This is where I belong. With you, with our family, with these mountains. I chose this life, Jonas, and I would choose it again 1,000 times over." "Even though it started with a mob trying to hurt you?" Sarah smiled. "Especially because of that. If not for that terrible day, I never would have found you. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things." Jonas wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. Wise words from a wise woman. They stood together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, just as they had done countless times before. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, and Sarah felt at peace. Her father had been found years ago, living under an assumed name in California. He had been brought back to face justice and serve time in prison. Sarah had visited him once, more for her own closure than for his sake. He had apologized, had tried to explain, but Sarah had realized she no longer needed his explanations. She had built a life completely separate from his mistakes, and his choices no longer had power over her. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she refused to carry the weight of his sins anymore. She had left that prison a free woman in every sense of the word. Now, standing with Jonas in the mountains they both loved, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a frightened woman facing a mob to a wife, mother, teacher, and pillar of the mountain community. From someone defined by her father's crimes to someone defined by her own choices and actions. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas asked. "About that day you raised your hand and stopped the mob," Sarah said. "About how one moment can change everything." "It changed my life too," Jonas said. "I went into town that day planning to buy supplies and leave as quickly as possible. Instead, I found the person I had been waiting for my whole life without knowing it." "Do you think we would have met if not for that day?" Jonas considered. "I like to think we would have found each other eventually. Some things are meant to be." "I believe that too," Sarah said. They walked back to the cabin as full darkness fell, their path illuminated by starlight and the glow of lamps in the windows. Inside, Thomas had a fire going and supper cooking. At 19, he had decided to stay on the homestead and pursue his art while helping his parents. His paintings of the mountains were gaining recognition, and he sold them to tourists in galleries in Denver. The three of them ate together, talking about the day and making plans for tomorrow. After supper, Thomas went to his studio space in the barn to work on a new painting, and Jonas and Sarah settled by the fire. "I have been thinking," Jonas said, "we should write down our story, for the grandchildren and their children, so they know how we came to be here, how this family started." "That is a lovely idea," Sarah said, "though I am not sure I am the one to write it. You were always the better storyteller." "We will write it together," Jonas said. "Take turns, your perspective and mine. That way, we get the whole truth." So they began, spending winter evenings writing down their memories. Jonas's accounts of seeing Sarah surrounded by the mob, of the days in the cabin, of falling in love with a woman he barely knew, but somehow understood completely. Sarah's recollections of her terror and despair, of the mountain man who stood between her and danger, of discovering that home was not a place but a person. They wrote about their wedding, the births of their children, the challenges and triumphs of building a life in the mountains. They wrote about their love, how it had grown and changed but never faded. They wrote so their descendants would know that even in the darkest moments, hope and love could be found. The manuscript filled several journals by the time they finished. Thomas read it and immediately wanted to create illustrations for it. Ellen, who had inherited her mother's teaching spirit, wanted to share it with the mountain school she had helped establish. Henry wanted to have it properly published so the wider world could know their story. "It is just our lives," Jonas said, bemused by his children's enthusiasm. "Nothing special." "It is everything special," Sarah corrected. "It is proof that people can change, can heal, can find happiness even after terrible things. That is a story worth sharing." In 1910, Jonas and Sarah celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and the extended mountain community they had helped build. The gathering was held in the meadow near their cabin, and someone had erected a banner that read, "35 years of love and mountains." Jonas stood before the crowd, his arm around Sarah, and spoke with the same quiet authority he had used to stop the mob all those years ago. 35 years ago, I was a broken man living alone in these mountains. I thought that was all I was good for. Then Sarah came into my life, and she showed me I was wrong. She taught me that the strongest man is not the one who stands alone, but the one who stands with others, who stands for others. I stood between her and an angry mob once, but she has stood beside me every day since, making me better than I ever could have been alone. To my wife, the love of my life, Thank you for choosing me." There was not a dry eye in the meadow, and Sarah had to wipe tears from her own face before she could respond. Jonas Blackwood, you saved my life that day in Copper Creek. But more than that, you gave me a life worth living. You saw me when I felt invisible, believed in me when I doubted myself, loved me when I felt unlovable. These 35 years have been the greatest gift. Here is to 35 more." They kissed to thunderous applause, and the celebration continued long into the night with music, dancing, and storytelling. The grandchildren played together in the meadow, and Sarah watched them with joy. This was her legacy, not just the children and grandchildren, but the community they had helped nurture, the school they had built, the values they had passed on. As the years advanced, Jonas and Sarah slowed down as all people do, but they never stopped living fully. Jonas still walked his trap lines, though not as far or as often. Sarah still taught, though now she focused on training younger teachers to take over. They had earned their rest, but neither was ready to stop contributing. In the summer of 1915, Sarah was 61 and Jonas was 65. They had been married 40 years, and Jonas decided to mark the occasion by taking Sarah on a trip to Denver. Neither had been to the city in years, and Henry insisted on accompanying them to make sure they were comfortable. Denver had grown enormously since they had last seen it, with electric lights, automobiles, and buildings that scraped the sky. It was overwhelming and exciting, and ultimately made both Jonas and Sarah grateful for their mountain home. "Too loud, too crowded, too much rushing about," Jonas grumbled as they rode the train back to the mountains. "But nice to visit," Sarah added, "and nice to know we do not have to stay." Henry laughed. "You two are incorrigible. The world is changing, and you are perfectly happy in your mountain cabin." "Because it is the right place for us," Jonas said simply. "Never apologize for knowing where you belong." Back in the mountains, they fell into their familiar rhythms. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. The war in Europe touched even their remote corner of the world when some of the young men from mountain families enlisted. Jonas and Sarah wrote letters and sent packages to those boys, and mourned with their families when some did not return. But through it all, their love remained constant. They were each other's anchor, each other's home. Age slowed their bodies but not their spirits. They still walked to their ridge to watch sunsets, still sat by the fire and read to each other, still reached for each other's hand a dozen times a day just to maintain that connection. In 1920, they celebrated their 45th anniversary with a quieter gathering than before, just family and close friends. Jonas was 70 now, his hair completely white, his steps a bit slower. But his eyes were still sharp and clear, and when he looked at Sarah, it was with the same love he had shown 45 years ago. Sarah was 66, her hair silver, her face lined with laugh lines and the marks of a life well lived. She still had the bright intelligence and fierce independence that had first attracted Jonas, and he still loved her more than words could express. 45 years, Jonas marveled as they sat together on the porch after the guests had left. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I saw you surrounded by that mob. Other times it feels like I have known you my entire life." "Both are true," Sarah said. "Time is strange that way. I can remember exactly how you looked that day, how safe I felt the moment you stepped between me and that crowd. I remember thinking this man would protect me. I did not know then that you would also love me, cherish me, build a life with me." "Best decision I ever made," Jonas said, "raising that hand and stopping that mob. Best moment of my life, because it brought me to you." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars emerge. They had carved out a beautiful life in these mountains, raised good children who had gone on to raise good children of their own. They had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. In the spring of 1925, Jonas fell ill with pneumonia. At 75, his body could not fight it off as it once might have. Sarah nursed him with fierce devotion, refusing to leave his side. Their children gathered, knowing the end was near. On a clear morning in late April, with Sarah holding his hand and his family surrounding his bed, Jonas opened his eyes one last time. "Sarah," he whispered. "I am here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I am right here, my love." "Best 50 years of my life," Jonas said with effort. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for choosing me." Always, Sarah said. In this life, in the next. Always. Jonas smiled, squeezed her hand one last time, and closed his eyes. He died peacefully, surrounded by the love he had built over a lifetime. Sarah sat holding his hand for a long time after, unwilling to let go. Finally, Ellen gently touched her shoulder. "Mama, we should prepare him." "I know," Sarah said, but it took several more minutes before she could release his hand. They buried Jonas on the ridge overlooking the valley, the spot where he and Sarah had watched countless sunsets together. The entire mountain community came to pay respects to the man who had helped build it. Story after story was shared about Jonas's kindness, his strength, his quiet wisdom. Sarah stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and said her own farewell. "You stood between me and danger 50 years ago, Jonas Blackwood. You have stood beside me every day since. Now I will stand for both of us and finish this life you helped me build. I will see you again, my love. Until then, rest well." The days after Jonas's death were the hardest of Sarah's life. The cabin felt empty without his presence, without his deep voice and gentle touch. She found herself reaching for him 100 times a day, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. But Sarah Mitchell Blackwood was not the same frightened woman who had faced a mob 50 years ago. She had been loved deeply and had loved in return. She had raised children and taught hundreds of students. She had built a life in a community. She had strength she had not known existed. Her children wanted her to move in with one of them, but Sarah refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Your father and I built this together, and I am not leaving it. I will be fine." And she was. She continued teaching part-time, spending time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tending the homestead Jonas had carved from the wilderness. She was lonely, yes, terribly lonely at times, but she was also surrounded by love and the legacy she and Jonas had created together. On quiet evenings, she would walk to Jonas's grave on the ridge and sit there, telling him about her day, about the family, about the world that kept changing. She would watch the sunset and feel his presence in the mountains they both had loved. Sarah lived for 10 more years after Jonas's death, remaining sharp and independent until the very end. In the summer of 1935, at the age of 81, she died peacefully in her sleep in the cabin she and Jonas had shared. Her children found her in the morning, lying in bed with a peaceful expression and a smile on her face. On the bedside table was the manuscript she and Jonas had written years ago, telling their story, and clutched in her hand was one of Jonas's old bandanas, which she had kept close every day since his death. They buried her next to Jonas on the ridge. The inscription on her headstone read, "Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, 1854-1935, beloved wife, mother, teacher, she chose love." At her funeral, Henry stood before the large crowd and spoke of his parents' love story, how a mountain man had stood between a frightened woman and an angry mob, how that single moment of courage and protection had blossomed into a 50-year love story, how two broken people had found each other and built something beautiful. "My parents taught us that love is a choice you make every day," Henry said, "that family is not just blood but community, that the strongest person is not the one who stands alone, but the one who stands with others and for others. They lived those lessons every day of their lives, and their legacy lives on in all of us." The mountain community that Jonas and Sarah had helped build continued to thrive for generations. The school Sarah had started grew and evolved. The homestead became a family gathering place for children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond. Jonas and Sarah's story was passed down through the family, a reminder of where they had come from and the love that had started it all. And on the ridge overlooking the valley, two gravestones stood side by side, marking the resting place of a mountain man and his wife, who had proven that even in the hardest circumstances, love could not only survive but flourish, creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Their story became part of the mountain lore, told and retold by families around evening fires. The story of how Jonas Blackwood had stood between Sarah Mitchell and an angry crowd in the dusty main street of Copper Creek. How nobody had dared move after he raised his hand. How that single moment of courage had changed two lives forever and created a love story for the ages. In the end, Theirs was a story of redemption and hope, of finding love in unexpected places, of choosing connection over isolation, love over fear, action over indifference. It was a story that reminded people that one person standing up for what is right can change everything. And in the mountains of Colorado, where the wind still whispers through the pines and the streams still run cold and clear, the spirit of that love story endures. The cabin still stands, maintained by descendants who understand its significance. Couples hike to the ridge where Jonas and Sarah are buried to watch the sunset and make promises to each other. Teachers tell students about Sarah Mitchell Blackwood, who taught with dedication and love for over 50 years. Outdoorsmen and women speak of Jonas Blackwood, who knew the mountains like no one else and lived his values every single day. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations built their own lives and loves. And that is perhaps the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind, proof that one moment of courage, one choice to stand up for another person, one decision to embrace love instead of fear, can echo through eternity, touching lives that will never even know the original names, but will feel the impact of the choices those two people made so long ago in the wild Colorado mountains of the American West.